Welcome back to Theosophy and Beyond, where we explore the deepest currents of consciousness and decode the wisdom hidden in our most profound dream experiences. I'm your host, Zorho Kathos, and today we're diving deep into a vision that came through the archetypal force of Medusa, that misunderstood figure who represents not monstrous destruction, but rather the terrifying and necessary power to stop illusion in its tracks and see the truth with crystalline clarity. When most of us think of Medusa, they picture the Gorgon whose gaze turns viewers to stone. But what if that petrifying power isn't about destruction at all? What if it's about the ability to freeze time, to stop the rushing current of unconscious living, and to force ourselves and others to truly see what's happening around us? Today's vision reveals Medusa's gift in two profound ways. First, through the power to control time itself, and second, through the moral clarity that allows us to recognize and protest against the consumption of loyalty, even when that consumption has become socially normalized. This is Gnosis about developing the spiritual backbone to stop, see, and speak truth in a world that prefers to keep moving without examining what it's actually doing. The vision began with me possessing an extraordinary power, the ability to control the forward movement of time itself. I could slow things down, speed them up, or stop them altogether. The setting was a school, that institution where we're supposed to learn how reality works and how to function within it. The time control ability represents what I've come to understand as one of Medusa's primary gifts, temporal sovereignty. In ordinary consciousness, we're swept along by time's current, reactive rather than responsive, always playing catch up with circumstances beyond our control. But Medusa consciousness offers something radically different, the power to step outside time's automatic flow and choose how to engage with each moment. The school setting is crucial here. Schools represent the conditioning process. Excuse me. Schools represent the conditioning process, the systematic programming that teaches us to accept the pace and priorities that society imposes upon us. We learn to move when the bell rings, to focus on what's deemed important, to measure our worth by external standards of progress and achievement. But with Medusa's gift of temporal control, I could manipulate time itself within this institutional setting. This represents the awakened consciousness that refuses to be enslaved by external pacing. It's the recognition that we have far more control over our experience of time than we've been taught to believe. The practical application is profound. How often do we feel rushed, overwhelmed, like we're constantly behind schedule in our spiritual development or life goals? Medusa teaches us that this is largely an illusion. We can learn to slow down time through presence, to speed up our progress through focused intention, and most importantly, to stop time altogether through moments of complete stillness and awareness. When we develop this temporal sovereignty, we're no longer victims of time, but collaborators with it. We can stretch a moment of beauty into what feels like hours. We can compress periods of necessary but unpleasant work into manageable segments. We can freeze time entirely when we need to make crucial decisions or simply appreciate what's right in front of us. This is practical magic at its most fundamental level, the recognition that time itself is more malleable than we've been conditioned to believe, and that conscious awareness can dramatically alter our relationships with temporal experience. That the time control manifested in a school environment adds another layer of meaning. Schools are meant to be places of learning, but they're also institutions of conformity, places where we learn to suppress our natural rhythms in favor of external scheduling, where we're taught to value information over wisdom, where we learn to compete rather than collaborate. Having temporal sovereignty in a school setting represents the possibility of learning at our own pace, according to our own inner rhythms, focus on what actually serves our development rather than what serves institutional requirements. It's about reclaiming education as a sacred process rather than a social obligation. In practical terms, this means we can learn to Slow down time when we're receiving important information, whether in meditation, in conversation with wise teachers, or when insight is arising naturally. Instead of rushing through spiritual practices or profound experiences, we can extend these moments, milking them for all the wisdom they contain. Speed up time when we're engaged in necessary but repetitive spiritual work, the daily disciplines that build our foundation but don't require extended attention to each individual repetition. We can compress the experience of routine practice while maintaining its effectiveness. Stop time completely when we need to make crucial decisions, when we're facing spiritual crossroads, or when we simply need to step out of ordinary consciousness and remember who we truly are beneath all the social conditioning. The school setting reminds us that we're always students of consciousness, always learning, but we don't have to accept the pacing or priorities that external authorities want to impose upon our learning process. We can become sovereign students, learning at the speed of insight rather than the speed of institution. Then the vision shifted dramatically, revealing something far more disturbing. I witnessed people eating small dogs and turning them into cigars, consuming loyalty itself and transforming it into something to be burnt up for temporary pleasure or relaxation. Here the dogs clearly represent loyalty in its purest form, that unconditional devotion, faithfulness, and trust that forms the foundation of all authentic relationships. Dogs embody the kind of loyalty that doesn't calculate benefits, doesn't keep score, doesn't withdraw affection based on circumstances. They represent the sacred bond of mutual care and protection that makes genuine community possible. Watching people eat these embodiments of loyalty reveals a devastating critique of how our culture treats this most precious of virtues. We consume loyalty. We take it from others without reciprocating. We expect it from our partners, friends, and employees while offering only conditional commitment in return. We literally devour the loyalty of others to feed our own needs and desires. But even worse, we turn loyalty into cigars. We transfer this sacred quality into something to be burnt up for temporary pleasure, something to be consumed and destroyed rather than honored and reciprocated. The cigar image is particularly powerful because it represents taking something pure and natural and processing it into a luxury item that creates smoke and ash, beautiful in the moment but ultimately destructive. This speaks to how we've learned to commodify even the most sacred aspects of human relationship. Loyalty becomes something we purchase through salary, through gifts, through promises we may or may not keep. We burn through the loyalty of others like expensive tobacco, enjoying the temporary pleasure while destroying the very thing that could provide lasting security and joy. My response in the dream was immediate and clear. I had the desire to protest against this consumption of loyalty. This represents what happens when Medusa consciousness encounters collective unconsciousness. It cannot remain silent. The awakened conscious must speak against the normalization of cruelty, even when that cruelty has become socially acceptable. This protest impulse is crucial because it represents the moral clarity that comes with temporal sovereignty. When we can stop time and truly see what's happening around us, when we're no longer swept along by the unconscious momentum of social conditioning, we begin to recognize behaviors and systems that we previously accepted without question. The practical application here is learning to develop what I call Medusa courage, the willingness to speak truth even when it stops conversation, even when it makes others uncomfortable, even when it forces people to look at things they prefer to ignore. This isn't about being self-righteous or superior, but about having the spiritual backbone to name what we see clearly. In daily life, this might mean refusing to participate in conversations or activities that consume the loyalty of others, gossip that betrays trust, business practices that exploit dedication, relationships that take without giving. Speaking up when we witness the commodification of sacred qualities like loyalty, love, trust, or devotion, whether in our workplaces our families, or our communities. Modeling reciprocal loyalty by being the kind of person who honors and protects the faithful devotion that others offer us, who treats loyalty and sacred rather than who treats loyalty as sacred rather than disposable. Excuse me. Creating spaces where loyalty can flourish safely. Relationships and communities where faithfulness is honored rather than exploited. Where commitment is mutual rather than one-sided. What makes this vision specifically a Medusa teaching is the way it combines temporal sovereignty with moral clarity. Medusa's petrifying gaze isn't random destruction. It's the power to stop illusion in its tracks and force recognition of truth. When we develop the ability to control our relationship with time, we also develop the capacity to see clearly what's actually happening in each moment. This combination is essential for effective spiritual activism. Without temporal sovereignty, we're too caught up in the rush of daily life to clearly perceive systemic problems. Without moral clarity, we might use our temporal power for selfish purposes rather than in service of truth and justice. But when we combine the two, when we can slow down time enough to truly see what's happening, and when we have the courage to speak about what we see, we become agents of conscious transformation rather than passive participants in unconscious systems. The practical integration involves developing what I call sacred timing, learning when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to intervene and when to allow natural consequences to unfold. This isn't about rigid rules, but about developing the sensitivity to read each situation accurately and respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. How do we cultivate these Medusa gifts in practical daily life? How do we develop temporal sovereignty and moral clarity without becoming rigid or self-righteous? Mindful time entry. Before beginning any activity, consciously choose your relationship with time. Decide whether this task needs slow, careful attention or efficient, focused energy. Sacred pausing. Throughout the day, practice stopping time for just a few seconds, long enough to check in with your deeper awareness and ask if you're moving in alignment with your authentic purpose. Rhythm awareness. Notice your natural energy rhythms and learn to work with them rather than against them. Schedule important spiritual work during your peak awareness times. Truth witnessing. Regularly ask yourself what you're seeing that you haven't been willing to acknowledge. What truths have been hiding in plain sight? Loyalty auditing. Examine your relationships and commitments. Where are you consuming loyalty without reciprocating? Where are you offering loyalty that isn't being honored? Courageous speaking. Practice expressing difficult truths with compassion but without compromise. Learn to speak in ways that stop illusion without destroying the person caught in it. Sacred activism. Use your temporal sovereignty in service of moral clarity. Take time to research issues deeply before acting, but don't use research as an excuse for indefinite delay. Protective presence. Learn to use Medusa's petrifying power to protect yourself and others from exploitation, manipulation, or abuse, creating boundaries that stop harmful behavior in its tracks. Medusa's teachings through this vision reveal one of the most practical and necessary spiritual gifts we can develop, the combination of temporal sovereignty and moral clarity that allows us to stop illusion and see truth clearly. This isn't about becoming judgmental or rigid, but about developing the backbone to live according to our deepest values, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. The ability to control time represents our power to step out of unconscious reactivity and choose our responses consciously. The protest against consuming loyalty represents our responsibility to speak truth when we witness the destruction of sacred qualities. Together, these gifts create what we might call awakened presence, the capacity to be fully present in each moment while also maintaining clear awareness of what serves life and what destroys it. This is the Gorgon's true gift. Not the power to destroy through sight, but the power to stop destruction through sight. In our current world, where loyalty is commodified, where we're constantly rushed through experiences without time to truly absorb their meaning, where speaking truth has become increasingly dangerous, Medusa's gifts are more necessary than ever. The question for each of us is, are we ready to develop temporal sovereignty, to stop being victims of time and become collaborators with it? Are we willing to cultivate the moral clarity that sees through social conditioning to recognize what truly serves life? And ultimately, do we have the courage to use these gifts not just for our own spiritual development, but in service of protecting what's sacred in a world that has forgotten how to value it? The power to stop time and see clearly is available to anyone willing to develop it. The question is whether we're ready to use it responsibly, courageously, and in service of truth rather than comfort. Thank you for joining me in exploring Medusa's gifts of temporal sovereignty and moral clarity. I encourage you to experiment with controlling your relationship to time, to notice where loyalty is being consumed without reciprocation in your life, and to practice the courage of speaking truth when illusion needs to be stopped in its tracks. Until next time, remember, the power to stop and see clearly is one of the most practical spiritual gifts we can develop. Use it wisely.